A very, very simple process. Now I want to emphasize that particularly because the process I'm going to talk about is very simple and very practical. That's a key point. Sometimes in education people say if something is simple, it can't really be worthwhile, and people want things to be very complicated, and then they say they're very worthwhile, but unfortunately we can't use them. So we're going to be looking at something very simple, very powerful, very effective. Now let's look for a moment at the whole business of teaching thinking. And I'm not going to go into this in great detail, but just in some detail. First, we might say there's osmosis. And we say if we have a very gifted teacher and a long exposure to youngsters, then some of the skills, the thinking habits of that very gifted teacher will transfer to the youngsters. And that is certainly true. It does happen, but it's not very practical because you need a long exposure and you also need a lot of very, very gifted children. So as a practical process, that really doesn't work. Then we might say if we wait for children to make mistakes in thinking, and then we correct these mistakes, clearly children will make, or youngsters, students, pupils, will make thinking which has no mistakes, and therefore it's going to be very good thinking because it has no mistakes. Unfortunately, that's not true. Suppose you said we're going to teach people how to drive a car by making it so that they don't make any mistakes. Well, the simplest thing to do is to leave the car in the garage, and you won't make any mistakes, but you won't get anywhere either. In other words, just avoiding mistakes is totally insufficient. We need the generative, productive aspects of thinking. Just avoiding mistakes is not enough. Then we might say we're going to have discussions, and we're going to have children discussing some subject, and as they discuss it, we're going to encourage them to use better thinking, and we're going to hope they're going to abstract these thinking points and then perhaps use them elsewhere. Unfortunately, that doesn't happen well either, because if your attention is on the subject of the discussion, it's very difficult to pay attention to the abstracted points. So the process which I prefer is the tools process. Tools process means we create some tools, some frameworks, which we then practice on different situations. That embeds skill in the tool, and then you take the tool and you apply it elsewhere. In other words, the skill is portable. You can take it and apply it anywhere. And that's what we're going to be looking at. One particular tool, one particular frame. Now, it's true that some people say, quite rightly, they say whatever we're teaching, whatever subject we're teaching it in a thinking manner, and surely if we teach subjects well, then thinking is going to improve. Youngsters, students are thinking all the time, and if you're thinking all the time, surely your thinking will improve. Not necessarily so. Imagine that you are a typist, and at the age of 15, you start typing with 2 fingers, and suppose you become a journalist, and for the rest of your life you're typing hundreds, maybe thousands of words every day. At the age of 60, you will still be typing with 2 fingers. You might now be a very good 2-finger typist. Similarly, the fact that you're thinking does not make you better at thinking. It only makes you better at that particular type of thinking you're doing. So if you're a bad thinker and you practice a lot, you will become an excellent bad thinker. You won't suddenly change to becoming a good thinker. Now, if that youngster at the age of 15 had taken a 5-week course in touch typing, then for the rest of that youngster's career, that youngster would have been a touch typist. So we need to teach thinking explicitly, directly. The notion that it'll just rub off because thinking is being used in other subject areas is not sufficient. We can do things very directly. Now, the particular frame that I'm going to talk about in a little while is very powerful. For instance, IBM use it at one of their top laboratories. They found it reduced meeting times to 1/4 of what they had been before. Indeed, a friend of mine was involved in jury service, 2 parallel cases. The first case, the jury deliberated for 4 hours to reach a conclusion. Second case, using the 6 hats framework, within 15 minutes, they had a solution. Much, much quicker. There was a simple little exercise I did on some senior public servants, and these were mostly university graduates, and I asked them to think about a subject and then crossed over the subject and asked them to use the hats on it, and they had a 493% change in their thinking. Now, there's almost a 5-fold increase in thinking productivity using the very simple frame that I'm going to talk about now. What do we mean by a frame? Well, imagine we send an explorer off to an island, and this explorer comes back, and we say, what did you see? The explorer says, well, there was this volcano in the corner which was smoking, and there was this funny bird which didn't fly. And you say, well, that's fine, but what else did you notice? What else did you see? And the explorer says, well, that's all that caught my attention. So you send the explorer back, and this time you say, very simply, I want you to look north, take your notebook, see what you see. I want you to look east, take your notebook, and south, and west, and so on. When you come back, you'll have a much fuller scan of that island. Now, what is north, south, east, and west? They are just frameworks for directing attention. So the framework I'm going to be looking at now is one which allows us to direct attention, allows us to do one thing at a time. And that is very, very important. One thing at a time. Often when we're thinking, the main problem is confusion. We're trying to do everything at the same moment. So 2 things happen. One is we are confused. The second thing is, unless we have frames to direct attention, we only see a very small part of what there is to see. So we're going to be looking at the 6 hats, which is a way of directing attention, a way of doing one thing at a time. Now we need to go back to what our traditional thinking is. Where did our traditional habits of thinking come from? And we go back to the fall of Rome in AD 400. After the fall of Rome in Europe, there were the Dark Ages. Dark Ages because we don't know much about them, because the great learning, reading, writing, scholarship of the Greek-Roman period disappeared. Then came the Renaissance. Renaissance was the rediscovery of classic Greek-Roman thinking. This was like a breath of fresh air, allowed humankind to use logic and reason to work things out, gave humankind a more central position in the universe. So this wonderful new thinking was eagerly adopted by a civilization, both by the church and the non-church, became the dominant software of Western thinking and has remained so to this day. Well, what was this wonderful thinking? We need to go back in history again to 400 to 300 BC, and the Gang of Three. First of the Gang of Three was Socrates. Socrates was mainly concerned in showing why things were wrong. Socrates was very interested in dialectic or argument. In 80% of the discussions in which Socrates was involved, there was no constructive outcome. And when his listeners said, you say everything is wrong, so what is right? Socrates would say, not my business. My business is to say what's wrong. Now, for his purposes, this was absolutely correct. Socrates was trying to find out how people used words like love, justice, courage, and so on. So just as if you were discovering the rules of grammar, if you say, well, that's a bad use, and that's a bad use, and that's a bad use, in the end, you are indeed left with the right uses. So for his purposes, that was fine. But the emphasis was very much on saying, if we can show what is wrong, we will be left with what is right.